Thanks very much, Tim. That's quite a reputation to live up to. So I'm hands up. I'm not really a coffee person as such. I call myself a coffee biologist. Today, I want to talk about something that's coming to fruition, but just at the end of this project, or it's actually part of another project, the Coffee Atlas of Ethiopia. And I'm going to explain what that is with a heavy accent on climatic variables and their importance. So, of course, Ethiopia, this is a focus on Arabica coffee. And in that name, there is, of course, a real misnomer, Arabica coffee. Why is it called Arabica coffee? Well, early botanists believed that it actually came from Arabia, from the Yemen, and that name held, or that opinion held, at least, until at least the mid-19th century, because of the association of coffee drinking in the Yemen, and also because Ethiopia was very poorly known, particularly botanically. So here we are, here's Ethiopia. Just for those who don't quite understand wild plants, I'm talking about wild plants here. I'm also going to be talking about coffee cultivation, coffee farming. But wild Arabica is only found in Ethiopia and one small place in South Sudan. So that's about it. That's where the wild Arabica comes from. Where does it grow? It's restricted to humid, sort of cool tropical forests. This is a typical example from southwest Ethiopia. And here's a shot of us working with the SCAA and World Coffee Research in South Sudan. Of course, it's been in those places for millions of years, and then hundreds, perhaps even thousands of years ago, it came out of that forests and was used probably primarily as a food, and then at some point or other, it was taken, roasted, and consumed as the beverage we know as coffee. And just to illustrate the link with food, here's a shot from a hotel in Harar, and it shows at the top coffee leaf tea, kishia, which is the cascara, and then the whole fruits at the bottom there. Ethiopia is the world's 5th largest producer, the biggest producer in Africa. The sector employs about 15 million primary producers, farmers, providing about 25% of Ethiopia's export earnings. So it's big. It's a big part of Ethiopia's financial sector, but perhaps more than that, it's a massive part of Ethiopian culture. We think in Europe that we may have a burgeoning cafe culture, but for those of us that have been to Ethiopia, we know that coffee's everywhere. Many, many cafes serving coffee in towns and cities, and in villages, the coffee ceremony bonds neighborhoods and societies together. And around 50 or perhaps even 60% of the coffee produced in Ethiopia is actually consumed in Ethiopia. So that gives you some sort of scale. Oops, a bit sensitive. But my question today is, how well do we know Ethiopia? Amongst us, I might ask the question, how many people source Ethiopian coffees for their roasteries or businesses? Show of hands. Great. How many people have been to Ethiopia, been to Origin? Wow, that's impressive. I'm in difficult waters, I think. So in 2013, we started a project looking at how we might make the Ethiopian coffee sector climate resilient. Could we find a pathway for the sector to sustain itself even under climate change? And I won't talk very much about that, but what I will say, just a few take-home thoughts, is that my argument is that the coffee landscape of Ethiopia, and indeed the world, is ever-changing. over the 400 years we've been growing coffee, it's changed dramatically. Robusta is only 100 years old, for example. And in the future, it will change even more under accelerated climate change. What our study showed was if Ethiopia were to carry on business as usual, there would be a 30 to 60% decline in productivity. However, if they chose a pathway where they altered the coffee growing landscape, in fact, you could grow 4 times the amount of coffee. That's a 400% increase, even under climate change. There's plenty of land in plenty of countries that will continue to grow coffee across this century. Now, this sort of work doesn't get done by me alone, of course. It's based on a big team, not only in Kew, but also in Ethiopia. Unfortunately, I don't have a nice picture of our Ethiopian colleagues, but they, of course, played a critical role. And these people have specific skill sets, including the analysis of satellite imagery, mathematical modeling, computer modeling, climatology, etc. Skills that I don't have, and it's essential to have a team like this so you can do this sort of work. Now, as we move forward with the project, we actually realized that the data we were collecting perhaps could be used to produce some other products. One of those was the Coffee Atlas. So to give you an idea of the scale and approach, one of the things we did was to look at the forest cover. You've seen those pictures of forest production systems. 80% of Ethiopia's production is based in forest or forest-like systems. So therefore, it's important to capture that forest type, which you do via satellite imagery. And this is down to a very fine scale of 30-meter resolution. So it goes beyond what anybody else has done before for any coffee-producing country. Then we have to, that can be done in desktop. It's based on NASA's satellite data, dedicated satellite data. Then you've got to actually get up off your arse, get out there, and collect some ground data. So we had 15 expeditions over 3 years. We traveled the length and breadth of the country. These dots represent our data collection points. And here we also see a departure from many other studies which don't actually do any on-ground survey work. What we wanted to do was make sure that the landscape we were trying to represent was accurate. If you have this sort of data, the other thing you can do is produce a computer model. And this computer model is based on climatic variables. So it's picking out the climate envelope for Arabica coffee in Ethiopia. To give you some idea, rough idea of what that looks like, here we have 6 coffee growing regions and their climate profiles. If you look at blue bars, you can see they're very different. Let's just focus in on one of those. This is Limu. It's got a nice climate envelope for coffee, a nice distribution of rainfall. It's not too hot. The dry season is marked, but it still has enough moisture to keep the plants alive. So it's a nice average sort of useful climate profile. Let's look at Yogachefe. Here we're on the other side of the Rift Valley, so you can see the rainfall pattern, which are the blue bars, is bimodal. And that means there's a dip in rainfall around June, July. Doesn't matter, there's still enough moisture in the soil. Fine. If we look at someone like Bahedar in the north, you can see it looks like it has a lot of rainfall. Those blue bars are quite high, and indeed Bahedar has 1,600 millimeters of rainfall. But look at these areas here. A very short, harsh, wet, dry season. And that creates a big stress issue for the plants. Let's look at this in another way. We have the green and red. Those are Agaro and Masha. Nice climate profiles for coffee. Look at the blue bar, Bahedar. We can see huge deficit of water during the dry season. So during that, particularly during the end of the dry season, the plants are incredibly stressed. There is a surfeit of rainfall, but you don't need all that rain because the soil is wet enough already. Now, I talked about ground truthing. What does that actually mean? Well, Firstly, we looked at the plants. How were the plants responding to those different climates? Here's a healthy plant, the end of the wet season, all well and good, nice green, turgid leaves. Here's a plant under stress. You can see the leaves are crisped, curled, wilted. And here are dead plants. Now, one of the things the modelling team said to me is that when you take these models out to Ethiopia, what you should see, if the model says unsuitability for coffee or moderate suitability, you should see those responses on the ground. And the nice thing for the ground team is that that's what we saw. So we had good correspondence between the desktop work and the ground. Of course, we also talked to farmers. How was their coffee growing year? How was last year's coffee growing season? And how we also asked them what it was like on a generational basis. So what was it like for their fathers? What was it like for their father's father? And what you gain from that is that climate change is slow, but it's steady. So climate change isn't something that's happened in the last decade. It's been happening for at least the last 100 years. It's steady and slow. And in places like Harar, or some of the places in Harar, the image which I've shown you earlier, that is where a coffee growing area hits the tipping point. It's got so far that it's not only not producing good quality coffee, it's not producing any coffee at all because the plants are dead. As I've said, I'm not really a coffee person, but we also consumed a lot of coffee en route, and we also bought a lot back to see if there's any relationship between climate, location, and cut profile. The Coffee Atlas, it won't look like this, so just to give you a bit of a mock-up. It should be available hopefully by the end of the year. It's with the designers at the moment. It covers not the entirety of Ethiopia, but pretty much all the areas you'd be interested in if you were a tourist, coffee tourist, and easily covers all the coffee areas. So it's 41 maps at very high resolution. What we also did was to divide the coffee landscape into 5 coffee zones and then 16 coffee areas. So there's a hierarchy. Each zone has a number of coffee areas. And that's good for descriptive purposes. It's based on the ECX list, but only very loosely. So this is what we end up with. We produced the first set of maps a year ago. Very, very happy with them. Took them out to Ethiopia. There was a major problem. The mapping data that we had, particularly for roads and towns, didn't really match what was on the ground. So we actually had to do our own we'd already done this level of cartography. Then we had to do what they did, many years ago, is actually go to the ground and do the cartography ourselves, which is an amazing amount of work. I'll give you an example here of how so the maps that you're using if you're traveling to Ethiopia are grossly inaccurate. And I'll give you an example. This is the road from Goba to Rira. This is the early version, and this is the late version. You can see that road at the bottom. Huge difference in that road. We've also added a town, and several mountains have disappeared, and 2 mountains have appeared. So really quite an amazing difference. We weren't able to do that for the whole of Ethiopia, but we think we've cleaned it up enough to be possibly the best map available for Ethiopia at the present time. So what does it actually tell you? Yeah, it's a map of Ethiopia, great, but it's a coffee atlas. So what is it actually telling you? Well, this is part of the Sidamo area. If you look at the key, what it will tell you is not only where coffee is being grown, and those are the dark green colours, but it also tells you the suitability of a coffee, whether that's a good climate for coffee, average or poor. And that has implications for buying coffee, for putting in new production areas, etc., etc. But it also tells you, and these are the sort of light bluer colours just here, where actually there is a lot of suitability, but there's no forest. So what we're saying to decision makers in Ethiopia is that actually these areas are great for growing coffee. All you need to do is plant some forest. So it could be a win. You could increase productivity and at the same time improve biodiversity value and improve carbon sinking. The Jabina symbols, I won't point this because I can never see it. These Jabina symbols show the major and minor coffee towns. So if it's a tipping Jabina, those are the towns. If it's a straight Jabina, those are the origins. We haven't done all of the origins, but we've done the major ones. In the later version, Guji is actually added to this map. What we can also do is use this data to project forward and give people an idea of suitability across this century. So if you're forming a relationship with the community or you want to raise their expectations in terms of a project, you better make sure that that area is climate resilient for coffee. So we can actually scale this information down to the farm level. So if anybody comes to us with a geolocation, we can give them a pretty good idea of what's going to happen across this century with climate change. Now I just want to run very quickly through some of the coffee areas, just to give you those who haven't been to Ethiopia or those who haven't travelled widely in Ethiopia, a sort of flavour for the various zones and areas. So here we have the North Zone, very poorly known. I don't know has anybody been to the North Zone, coffee zone in Ethiopia? It's way outside the main coffee growing areas. As I've shown you with the climate charts, it's really, the dry season is too long. However, where there is a stream or river, you can irrigate and grow coffee very successfully. The other interesting thing for this northern area is if you look at the top, just around Finote Salam below the lake, is you'll see that towards the end of the century, actually suitability improves for this area, mostly at higher ground. One of the interesting places we went to and we didn't know even existed before we started was Wembra or Debrecen. This is a high altitude coffee area. It was growing coffee quite successfully up until the 2000s, until the coffee crisis, and has now restarted because prices are better. Very high altitude. Processing still needs a lot of work, but the cherries seem to ripen more or less at the same time. And harvesting, although done mostly by children, is of a very high quality, and that's producing some quite characterful coffees. Let's go down to the main southwest. That's probably the best known area after Sidamo. We've got classic localities like Kaffa, Bonga, Lima, Agaru, that sort of area. And it's in places like Kaffa and Bonga, it's characterized by these wild coffee forests. Now these look like undisturbed, uninhabited forests, but if you go inside or you go around the edges, you'll see there's semi-forest coffee being produced within them. This is a very young planting, and then eventually those coffee trees actually get way above human height, and you can go in underneath them. Quite different from many Central American and South American production systems. And if you look at them from the outside, this is in Illabor. If you look at them from a distance, it looks like natural forest, but people are in there, they're living there, and they're producing coffee. Production standards are improving. It's a coffee nursery in Yayu in Illabor. Harvesting, of course, is all done by hand. No chemical inputs, no pesticides, no herbicides. It's organic coffee by default. In Lima, Jima areas, and increasingly in Welaga and Illabor, there are more and more washing stations, also in Kaffa and Bonga. So we're seeing a transformation away from areas producing purely naturals to high-quality wash coffees. And African beds are also on the increase. Let's look at perhaps one of the most famous or most talked about localities in Ethiopia, particularly recently, and that's Geisha, or Gesha. For those of us who don't know where it is, it's on the very edge of the southwest zone in the south, and of course has this link with Geisha coffee. Geisha comes from the village Gesha. It's just a transformation of the name. This is Hacienda Esmeralda in Panama. And I put this slide on to give you the first, not the first, but some other indications about the importance of climate. Well, I'll come back to that. So let's just for a moment look at the origin of geisha and kind of put it into context compared to most of the cultivars that we're working with. So these are the two main forest areas in the southwest and southeast. The hypothesis is that coffee came out of the southeastern forests to Harar, and from there to perhaps to West Sidamo, although it actually might be the case that there were forests in Sidamo, and those characteristic West Sidamo coffees might be wild relatives. Then to Yemen, possibly back to Harar, and then out of Yemen across the world, and then 400 years of domestication. So that's the main route for most of the cultivars that are grown outside Ethiopia. If you look at geisha, you can see that it's what we term a wild. So it hasn't gone through that domestication process. And the assumption is that because it hasn't gone through that process, it's retained a lot of the a more characterful cut profile. That's a hypothesis. Well, geisha looks much like any other area in the southwest. This is Adam Overton's farm, Geisha Village Estate. He is doing a great job there in supporting the local community, but also in tree planting. There's a lot of deforestation in the area, and he's developed a forest coffee production system. But also, importantly, he's pushing the bar really high for Ethiopia in terms of quality. I mean, he's going all guns blazing. This is a shot we took. These aren't geisha coffees. These are from the local area, but things have really developed for those guys, and they've recently won an award, best coffee in Africa or something like that. Going back to the geisha thing, what I believe Adam has found is that the geisha he's producing isn't the same as it is from Panama or Colombia. And there's a good reason for that. And again, it's back to the climate factor. If you look, these are several rainfall profiles for Ethiopia. You can see the dotted line is Bokete. So what this tells you is that if you can compare all those rainfall profiles in Ethiopia, Bokete has much, much more rain. If you look at temperature, Bokete is the dotted line at the top, it has far less seasonality. So we can't compare those two coffees directly because the climates are so very different. I put this in Pabelco. This is another origin that's really not very well known. This is Welaga, but Kelem Welaga over near the South Sudan border. Some really nice coffee growing environments and some very unusual and distinct coffees starting to come out of that area, both washed and natural. Quickly to the Rift. Not the best coffee growing climate. It's far too hot. Far not enough rain, and you can see that in the coffees. So these are just unsorted farm gate coffees. Rift on the left and the southwest on the right, and if you just a quick scan, you can see the beans are rounder and smaller. They're also harder. It's much more like a Yemeni mocha. And what we found generally is that in these drier, warmer environments, the coffee the shape of the coffee, the quality of the coffee is highly correlated with the environment. The southeast zone, that includes our well-known Sidamo origins. I want to mention 3 ones that you probably haven't heard of. That's Bensa, West Arsi or Nansebo, and Bale. Bale is an interesting part of Ethiopia physically. This is very high mountains. Once you're over the mountain pass into the forest, it's very lush and green. No coffee at these altitudes, but if you go down into the slightly lower forests, there is a lot of semi-forest coffee in production. I mention it because it's not well known. The cherries, when dried, look rather like longberry Haraz, and a really amazing profile that even I, who probably got that lowest score on the chart in Morton's talk, can identify out of a bunch of unnamed coffees. Let's finish on the Harar zone. Once a prominent producing area, now very much in decline. And it runs along a sharp ridge east of Addis, some way southeast of Addis, right the way up to Harar. And this is mainly a coffee garden area. It's not a forest production system area. This is what it looks like, even at high altitude. This is 1,800 meters. You can see quite a different character to the farms. It's produced mostly in sun, some in semi-shade. You can see the trees are very, very different in characteristics. Much, much drier. A little bit cooler to compensate for the lack of rainfall and the lack of rainfall. And there is quite a lot of terracing going on in some areas, which increases the soil moisture because you've got more soil depth. But this is the characteristic Harar coffee garden, fully exposed, unprotected, and occurring within a mixed cropping system, very small numbers per plot. So now let's get to the part you're probably most interested in, and that's cut profiles across Ethiopia. What are the factors affecting cut profile? And we already touched on this yesterday and today. DNA, of course. It's about the cultivar. That has a big influence, of course, on the profile. Then you've got all the environmental factors on that side. And what I would say is that in Ethiopia, the DNA and the environment is linked to locality. And that's why it's so important to have these aspects mapped on an atlas. On the other side of things, we've got the things that you guys do and the farmers do, the human intervention side. And there's a clear distinction between those two. Some things you can control, some things you have far less control over. So if you have a certain cultivar, a certain origin, there's nothing you can do about that other than swapping it out with something else. So back to climate, back to locality, back to location. Different climates linked to different localities. If you look at all the DNA data, the genetic data, is that those localities have specific genetic circumscriptions. So each area has a different genetic profile, more or less. That's interesting, but for us, what we're interested in is how that relates to chemistry. And I'd hope to tell you about a bit of work we're doing at the moment on chemistry and location of populations in Ethiopia, but it's not yet published. However, what I can say is the results are quite outstanding. I wouldn't have expected to see such profound chemical differences. So we're looking at the chemistry of actually the roasted bean, the non-volatiles, and the chemistry is off the scale. In fact, so off the scale that when we submitted this for publication, it was rejected outright because they said the coffees we'd used weren't Arabica. So it's surprising everyone. And we're having trouble convincing our peers that we actually used Arabica because the chemical profiles are so different. So the idea of the cupping is that we cup across Ethiopia, not every area, not every zone in fact, but the question is, can we actually group profiles together in some way? Are there characteristics that are common to each of the zones or some of the areas? So Tim's going to lead on this, but what I would say is please be kind on our samples. They're a mixture of washed and natural, and there are a huge variation in grades and cupping scores. So what you're looking for is the fundamental characteristics rather than the quality. Okay?
All right.
Thanks very much.
Let's give a big hand to Aaron Davis. Don't leave the stage. Because you were faster than you thought.
Ah,
so
okay. That's
are
good.
there any questions? No questions?
Wow.
Yes. Ben, wait for my mic, please.
Hi, Alan. Thanks for the presentation. Just a basic question.
Yeah.
If you were going to set up a farm in Ethiopia, knowing what you know now, like which region or area would you go for?
I think you could take any one of several coffee areas, depending on what you actually wanted to produce. But certainly there's huge scope in the southwest. If it were me, based on what I like, I would go for high altitude Sidamo. And that, so when I said the coffee landscape is changing, since we started the project and we ended the project, we've seen a huge amount of change, particularly in the development of new farms. So when we went to the ECX, which is the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange, they said they were developing a new area at 2,600 meters, which was unknown before. You would never plant coffee that high. So it's in constant flux. But I would definitely choose somewhere high. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Alec has a question.
To what extent are the Ethiopian authorities, there's a lot of politics and where things get grown, following what you have seen?
Yeah.
Are they going in the same direction that you would go if you were the authorities, or a different direction?
It's been interesting. Yeah, that's a great question. It's been interesting because what we've seen is some of this happening organically. So the area that ECX chose to develop, a very large production system actually came out in our modelling. So there's a good correspondence. The trouble in Ethiopia is what happens is you develop a relationship with somebody in the government and then they change position. It's pretty short term. But what we have been very pleased about is that the work that we've done has gone straight into policy documents that have gone straight at the highest level. This year we'll have 2 meetings, one with the government, one with the Ethiopian Academy of Sciences, and one with the Tea and Coffee Development Authority. So they do seem to be taking it seriously. I have heard that it's been a wake-up call, but it's in their interests. So there is a government mandate to increase coffee production fourfold. And what we've shown is that you can actually do that without bunging in loads of water and fertilizer. So there is a pathway. It's not going to be, it's going to be a rough road for some farmers. But if that's the objective of the sector in Ethiopia, then it's achievable until at least the end of the century. And then we better do something, or we better do something about climate change now, because beyond this century, if we don't, then we won't be worrying about coffee. That'll be the least of our worries.
Any other people want to? Yes?
I have a question, more regarding the cultivars around Ethiopia, which Because we all say heirloom on all the bags.
Yeah.
So what's going on?
Yeah.
Don't we know anything better than that?
We don't, I'm afraid. It's a subject that needs a huge amount of research, particularly with high-resolution genetics. There are thousands of heirloom varieties, land races, farmers' lines, but we don't know exactly what that means. Some people say that the classic opinion is that farmers grow 7 land races, 8 land races on each farm. That's nonsense. There just isn't space. Yeah, and somewhere like Geisha, Adam would go for that. But generally, there are hundreds and hundreds of names. What they actually mean is anybody's guess. But what I want to try and sort of see with the cupping is that if we can sort of capture some of that genetic separation, circumscription through cupping, which would be really exciting.
But could we not just use the geographic area? They are so linked to where they come from. And then when you have the highest average for this DNA profile, you call it Yerkeshire.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, you could. But there's so many complications because although it's against the law to move germplasm within Ethiopia, it happens. For those areas that aren't where wild coffee grows, such as the Rift, Bahidar, Ben-en-Shal Gumuz, well, where did that coffee come from? So that's another complication. You've got lots of coffee producing areas that don't have a local source of wild diversity. What you do find is that farmers will select on a number of criteria, including roasting, disease resistance, height of plant, that sort of thing, size of cherry. But it's like many of these things, it's hugely subjective. But the Ministry of Agriculture has developed a number of cultivars, which are mainly dwarf Katura-looking type things. And when you speak to the farmers, they have very strong views on whether they're good or bad. I won't say what they are, but it's definitely something that needs more closer investigation.